Welcome to Orthodox Family Life. Today we're back with Matushka Konstantina Palmer, and we're talking about spiritual sensitivity. So, welcome back, Matushka.
Thanks. It's great to be back again.
So, what made you want to talk about spiritual sensitivity?
I think when I was thinking of different topics we could talk about, I had gone through a lot of the talks I had given throughout the years, especially before COVID, when I would get invited to speak in person in different places in the United States and across Canada. And it had been one of the tiny, like a little small subcategory of a talk I had given once. And I honestly didn't even really remember the content and the stories that I'd had in there. But I thought it's a nice, and I wanted it sort of placed closer to the end too, because I feel like it's a really nice topic. As we've been discussing all of these maybe more obvious virtues or vices, depending, because like envy is a vice, but cheerfulness, spiritual joy is a virtue. I thought maybe we'd be a little bit more at this stage in Lent. Now our heart is maybe softened a little bit more to talk about a topic such as this, because spiritual sensitivity, we tried to define it a little bit in the last talk at the very end. Mm-hmm. And it was difficult for me to define it. And I think you actually did a better job of defining it than I did. But ultimately, spiritual sensitivity is like removing the calluses from our heart and being so attuned with our conscience that our conscience almost ceases to be a conscience, and it just is the voice of God and the grace of God. And it's our being so well attuned to the grace of God that we actually feel when we have done something that puts a barrier between us and God, and when we've done something that has allowed the grace of God to come closer to us. So that's like the ultimate, the par excellence version of spiritual sensitivity that we're seeking to acquire and to have, to be our guide. So obviously we have our conscience. This would be like the first step to acquiring spiritual sensitivity, is for us to actually follow our conscience, but ultimately to get to a place where it's so obvious to us when we have displeased Christ and when we have pleased him. So I thought of some nice stories really that exemplify this, since it is a difficult topic to fully, comprehend. Mm-hmm. And there's like nuance to it, because spiritual sensitivity isn't oversensitivity. It isn't emotionalism. Actually, St. Paisius. So, we talked about joyfulness and cheerfulness, and sort of St. Porphyrius being like a saint that really exemplifies that. Mm-hmm. If I had to choose a saint that fully exemplifies this spiritual sensitivity, it would probably be, both St. Ephrem of Catonachia, but St. Paisius, the Athonite as well. He put a lot of emphasis on, he would call it reverence, and he would say it's not to be confused with just piety, because it's not an external form. He would actually shy away from external forms if he didn't feel that his heart was in them, because he felt that it wasn't true reverence to just do an external action. So for him, everything was about the actual disposition of the heart. And so he talks, a lot about the spiritual sensitivity, this reverence, that by being reverent in little things, we become reverent in big things, and that cultivates that spiritual sensitivity.
Would you think that's related to the other thing he talks about a lot, which is spiritual nobility? Is it similar?
That's a really good question. I haven't read enough about him in recent history to remember how precisely he talks about spiritual nobility, but I would think that it would be very closely aligned, since what we're talking about is the actual state of being, of knowing when we have pleased Christ and we've displeased him, which would ultimately be the spiritual nobility, that you would always be in a state that maintained grace and attracted grace.
Yeah, I think he talked about it a lot in terms of people who did things out of philotimo, who out of love for others. So he would connect the spiritual nobility and philotimo. And maybe you want to explain that term real quick, because I'm never sure I'm saying it right either, but
You're saying it right, but it's a term that's very unique to St. Paisius.
Mhm.
It isn't a term that gets used in different contexts, and he had very unique language. He would use a lot of terms that he had a very interesting way with language that he would play, like words he would play off of them the way that they rhyme. So sometimes it was even hard to understand. Even Greeks like would read and be like, I'm not really sure what he means by this. But if I remember correctly, the way that you might know better than I, but philotimo is like, it's an honorable love. Like if you were to like literally translate it, it's like a self-sacrificial love but that's like kind of permeates everything, that
Mhm.
really is like that Christ-like love.
Yeah, and what strikes me about, the spiritual nobility and the Flotimo and what you're talking about with spiritual sensitivity is that they're both outpourings of a state of being. And so just kind of like I mentioned in a couple of episodes ago, like you could watch videos about how to be a classy woman and wear this kind of bag and sit this way. It's all this external stuff, but someone who is truly classy in the sense of it's
Mm-hmm.
really about being attentive to others. And there's like a whole this is like a non-spiritual thing I'm talking about here right now, but there's like a whole way of being that's considered classy, whether or not you're wealthy or whatever, right? So
Right.
people are trying to put the externals on and saying, this is how you do it. And I think it's the same with this, where this is an outpouring of a state of being. Like you can't just do the externals and say, oh, I have spiritual sensitivity or I have nobility or, noble love or something. It's coming from the inside out.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting way to think of it too, because with I know, so my master's degree was on the theology of icons, so I know that a little bit better, but I've heard it both about iconography and about chanting, that what is within you is what gets put into the icon. What is within you is what gets put into the chanting. And so if there are things that are impure in us, that even unintentionally, unknowingly, it's manifests in the icon. Whereas and same thing with the chanting, it manifests within the chanting. I just literally read this. I think it was St. Paisius who said it. But when you chant, he said, if you have like basically your ego in it or something that's impure in it, then you can make a mistake with like just the way you chant, it'll drive people out of the church. It just sounds like clanging brass. If, however, he said you chant with like your whole heart and soul to the Lord, then even when you make a mistake, it'll still sound sweet to people, and people will still feel that, it's not just about the music note and hitting the note. And the chanter in our parish is very much like that. And he explains it to us when he directs us as like, he's the chanter, but we have a choir in our parish, and he says, you have to remember you're standing before God. You are singing for God. So it's not just, he is very precise about the musical note, but he also wants us to be mindful of, we sing for God. We're not singing for anyone else. And that's why we want to sing with the most attention, with, our posture, reverent and appropriate, and it's the same thing with iconography. You put yourself into it knowingly or unknowingly. And I do remember, because I just read it yesterday. St. Paisius specifically says the icon of Actionis theme, which is it's an icon of the Mother of God at the monastery Philotheon, the Holy Mountain. So if anyone knows, if you're not sure what I mean, she wears blue and she holds Christ, and it's one of we call them Glycophilusa icons, like sweet kissing.
So Axionistin it is truly meet. It's where that hymn comes from.
Exactly, for this icon. And he said, because St. Paisius was an amazing artist himself.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. In his life, which was called Elder Paisius of Mount Athos, so now it would, I assume, be called St. Paisius. It's like a big, thick one with a green jacket. They have photos in it of some of his handiwork that he would do, amazing carvings of icons, of different things, really amazing things. Even like this little carving that he did of Prophet Moses on the top of Mount Sinai, when he lived in Sinai, he had
Right.
carved this
Mhm.
and receiving the 10 Commandments. And so anyway, he says about this icon, he says it's not precise. Artistically, the icon isn't precise, but it conveys so much grace. He says the iconographer, the God must have bestowed so much grace on that icon because of the reverence of the iconographer.
Yeah.
Like, so this is
Yeah.
like, this is the outpouring of what we have within us,
Yeah.
the spiritual state, like what we have within us is out. And same, you can hear certain chanters that would like bring tears to the eyes of the
Mhm.
most hardened criminal because their chanting voices, that when they chant, it's so pure because it's only for God's glory. Like there's nothing else in it that's of self, of the negative self, of the passions, of the corrupt
Mhm.
man. One of the nuns I know in Greece had heard a chanter and she felt like this, like so moved. And she asked her abbess, why, when I hear this chanter, does it move me so much? When I've heard many people who chant very beautifully. And the
Mhm.
abbess said it's because when he chants with his full heart and soul to the Lord. So that's why it moves you that way. Again, like this is
Mhm.
our spirituality, that we have that big of an
Mhm.
effect on people around us, on the icons we paint, on the things that we sing. It's amazing.
It is amazing, and I would guess that most of our viewers have experienced this themselves. I mean, I know that here we have, a Yarndisa that's very beloved, and, when she chants, especially I'm thinking of there's "This is the day of resurrection" at Pascha, she'll chant it, and then all the sisters repeat that line. And it's like, okay, she's old, she has a kind of a crackly voice, she can't hit the high notes anymore, but there's just, like you feel like your whole chest is going to explode because of the grace that's you know
Yeah.
and if you played that for somebody in the world who knew music well, they might not be too impressed with it, but you just after you scrape yourself off the floor, you can, get on with the service. It's just so powerful.
Yeah.
And not in a sentimental way, like you said, but, like, in a real, like,
Right.
something was transmitted in that moment. Some
Yeah.
beauty, some truth.
Exactly, exactly. The joy of the day of the resurrection gets
Mhm,
transmitted. The words come to life. We don't reenact our church doesn't put on a play every time we have a feast day. We experience the feast day.
mhm,
When the Archangel Gabriel came to the Theotokos, this is all like present tense. Our services are present tense because that's what we live through it. We live through the resurrection. We live through the crucifixion. Yesterday I was buried with you, and today I arise with your arising.
mm,
We live it. And so
yeah,
when we have these spiritual people who are so in tune with the grace of God, they communicate that grace to us. It's incredible. But to go back to what you said about the sentimentality, this is very important because when St. Paisius talks about like spiritual sensitivity and these topics, he makes a specific point to say about women being particularly sensitive. And this
mm,
is what he says. So he's talking about the conscience, so as a starting point, when we think of spiritual sensitivity, we think of the conscience. So he says our conscience has to be as delicate as cigarette paper. So for all you youngsters who only know about vape, cigarette paper. When I was a youngster and my dad would roll his cigarettes, that was like a thing for a time. People would try to save some
yeah,
money, roll their own cigarettes. It's extremely fine, very, very thin paper. So he says our conscience has to be as delicate as cigarette paper. Sensitivity is like the gold leaf on an icon. It's precious, but you have to be very careful with it. You barely touch it and it rubs off. If you aren't sensitive, you'll always be living in a dry asceticism. In other words, external forms, no
yeah,
matter what you do. But you also need to be strong enough to handle that sensitivity because otherwise you'll drown. Women are sensitive, but most of them lose it with their pettiness and their troubles because they don't also have the strength they need. So we
mhm.
waste our sensitivity. We
We're
preoccupy.
sensitive about the wrong things.
We're sensitive about the wrong things. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that pettiness sucks up all of our sensitivity, and we don't have that strength that allows us to apply that sensitivity appropriate to the appropriate things.
Wow. If you're not reading St. Paisios out there, please go get some of his books. I think I spent a decade just reading. It was around the time he was being canonized, and just, when you get to the end, just go back to the beginning and start
Yeah.
again. He's kind of our saint here in this family. My husband actually met him, about a year
Oh,
before
he
he's
did?
proposed. Yeah, about a year before he proposed, so,
On
um,
the Blue Mountain?
yeah. So it was, he's a very special saint to us. I'll just leave it at that, but we really love St. Paisios, so I can't say enough good things about him, but, okay, so
We Go
when
ahead.
you were originally asking about or telling us about the, sensitivity is, um, part of it is making sure that you're not, putting a barrier in between you and God, right? Do you think that there's an aspect of it where the same could be said for you and your neighbor? That you don't put any barriers between you and
Yeah,
other
I
people?
think because I think that that's how it works. Love God,
Mhm.
love God first, the first commandment, and then love others as yourself. So naturally, if we are in a place where we intensely feel the presence of God, there's no barrier there, then we should also feel that way towards those around us.
So what might that look like? Does it mean that we, don't ever, say difficult things to them? Does it mean what does that look like?
I think it looks different depending on the circumstance and depending on the people. It certainly isn't that we just say nice things to them, because if we have true spiritual sensitivity, then it's like having heightened senses. So we're very attuned to what is spiritually profitable and what isn't.
Mhm.
So we have to, with that spiritual sensitivity, discern what's best for the other person. It actually reminds me of one of the little boys in our parish. I don't know where we were going. Anyway, we were driving maybe to church. I'm not sure where we were. I remember we were in the car. So the phone rang through the car, and the boy, who was like, I don't know, 12 at the time, he was calling Father John, and he said, my friend invited me to a hockey game, but the hockey game is on Holy Friday night. And this is what he asked Father John: is there a way that I can please my friend? And these were his exact words. And this is how you can tell the child grew up listening to Father John's homilies.
Mm.
Is there a way for me to please my friend and be spiritually benefited?
Wow. That's the
Yeah,
question. Yeah,
that
yeah,
is the question. It's
yeah.
literally the question. And that's not really a question that we have an easy answer to. I mean, in that context, it's like, you got to come to the Holy Week. You got to come to the Holy Friday service.
Mm,
But the fact that the child knew that's the dilemma. How do
mhm.
I show love and also, have spiritual benefit?
You're right, not loving people to the point where you sacrifice your own spiritual life or
And
you
not in a way that would sacrifice their spiritual life.
yeah,
It's all context dependent,
yeah.
because it depends all the time. It depends. But if we are truly spiritually sensitive people, if we're becoming truly sensitive people, then we would have the presence of mind with the grace of God to be able to discern. Discernment is another really topic we could have talked about. Discernment would
Mhm.
come into spiritual sensitivity. Discernment is everything. It's one of the hardest virtues to have, because it's knowing what exactly to say and when. One of the biggest saints of discernment is Saint Daniel of Catanakia, who recently was canonized. He was canonized around the same time, I think, that Saint Joseph the Hesychist was canonized, and Saint Ephrem of Catanakia. And Father Daniel, I don't know how many people know about him, but you can read about him in different books about Athonite fathers. He had this gift of discernment. They talk about this. So he was actually able, when people had fallen into delusion, which is like the Slavonic term is prelest,
Mhm.
the Greek term is plani. So we say in English delusion, when they've fallen into delusion, which is like trickery of the evil. And it's not exactly demon possession, but it's like their thoughts are all muddled and they've been trapped. They've been trapped by the evil one. He actually had the gift where he could draw them back out of delusion, which is like the hardest thing. Like, it's one thing for a priest to be able to exorcise someone and for the demon to flee, a possessed person, but the person's not exactly possessed. It's even more, it's a very delicate matter and requires such a great deal of discernment because it's kind of intellectual. So when it can't be done with words necessarily because they might be able to rebut you rationally. So it needs to be done spiritually. So he had this gift. So really that's what I would say about spiritual sensitivity toward our neighbor is it requires discernment. And the only way to have discernment is to acquire the grace of God and is to have the memory of, or the knowledge, the presence of God with you at all times, that you intensely feel that so that you know by the movement of your own soul, whether or not something is profitable or not profitable for someone else. And we're talking extreme spiritual states at this, with this level, right? But there's things that we can do, baby steps that will allow us to get to that place. And one of the main things being that we actually would follow our conscience. And one of the things that a lot of saints say, Abbot Dorotheus, Saint Porphyrius, Saint Sophrony, and Saint Paisius, is you first have to do it in little things, and then you can do it in larger things. So Saint Paisius says, let me see if I have it here. If someone neglects the little things, the danger is that he'll start neglecting the greater, holier things. And then without realizing it, rationalizing it all to himself, this is nothing, that doesn't matter. He can end up, God forbid, totally neglecting the things of God and becoming irreverent, arrogant, and atheistic. So those are the things, that's our level. Our level is being reverent in small things.
Yeah. Is there a part in this where obedience to a spiritual father comes in? Because I think like with some of these smaller things that, whatever your rule is for like preparing for communion or just kind of what you do in your weekly spiritual life gets busy. It can be easy to start to rationalize, well, something came up, I have to not do this or bend on that. And I think maybe having that obedience to a spiritual father can help us just cut off any of that rationalization. It's like, well, this is what I was given. This is what I do.
Yeah, I don't think that there's anything we have talked about that would be something we could practice without a spiritual father. If we truly want to, acquire spiritual joy, if we truly want to abandon the cares of like the worry and not be, a Martha that occupies all of our noetic energy and time with the cares of this life, if we want to practice patience, if we want to flee from envy and acquire love, all of those things require a spiritual father, because as we said in the past, the spiritual father is our particular doctor who prescribes for us what our particular needs are. So this is why, like, we should be fasting according to the rules of our spiritual father. These are the little things. Fasting is a little thing. It's not a big thing. It's an absolute must. If we have a different circumstance that we can't fast, that's absolutely fine. It needs to be blessed though by the spiritual father, because otherwise it just means we're doing our will all the time. Obedience means submitting our will to God. Again, this is exactly what Jesus Christ did. He would talk about this, that he submits to the will of the Father. I mean, this is outside of our comprehension, because we know that it's the Holy Trinity. It's three persons, one God. And yet he still would say that he would subject himself to the will of the Heavenly Father. Everything that we've been talking about requires the guidance of a spiritual father. And, the prayer rule, these things are all the little things, doing our prayer rule, keeping our fast the way that it's been prescribed to us by our spiritual father, doing, confession, and anything else that's been given to us. If we don't honor those things, if we're not reverent in those regards, if we don't cultivate that reverence in those things, we're not going to be able to gain the reverence that would allow us to discern when grace has departed, which is some of the stories we'll get into, like the bigger, more amazing stories of like how a saint would realize when he had offended someone and when he hadn't offended, or, you know, when he had offended someone so that God departed, and when he didn't defend, when what his words that seemed offensive didn't cause God to depart. So to give an example of what I'm talking about here is Saint Ephrem of Catanakia. There's two stories that came to mind for me. So one is on the Holy Mountain, the peninsula where all the, you know, there's for 1,000 years, there's been exclusive monasteries for monks in the Garden of the Mother of God is what it's called.
Mm-hmm.
So there's boats on the Holy, like it's a huge peninsula. It's amazing. I'd gone once with an American abbess and one of her nuns, and we did like a boat tour around it. So the monasteries are gigantic. It's a huge place. And so there were little boats that could take you like to different ports to get around the Holy Mountain, to go to different skeets and monasteries. So one Saint Ephrem had gone to a port to get a boat to go elsewhere. And on the Holy Mountain, there's like secular lay people, workers. So the boat operator isn't a monk. You know, you have different people. You have lay people as well that work on the Holy Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are pious, some of them aren't. I believe in the story, this particular boat operator was actually a drunk. So he was drunk the day that he was picking up the saint. So what had happened was he had left the port early. The boat operator did. Saint Ephrem calls out to him, hey, I wanted to take your boat. Can you come back so I can get on the boat? So the boat operator is really ticked off, and he's like cursing out Saint Ephrem about having to come back to the port to get him. So Saint Ephrem gets on the boat. They go on their way. He drops him off wherever it was that Saint Ephrem wanted to be. And then that night, when Saint Ephrem, you know, starts to do his prayers and is planning on doing the divine liturgy because he was a priest, suddenly he felt within himself a wall go up between him and God. And he's like, he's trying to pray, and there's no, it's like, so this is what spiritual sensitivity is. It's picking up the phone and hearing that the line is dead. It's very hard for us to conceptualize this because our prayers probably aren't at that level. And if they are, glory to God, through the prayers of our spiritual father, our prayers are that intense that it's like we pick up the phone and we hear the dial tone. Again, for the youngsters, back in the day when you picked up a phone, it was like, burp, 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 like it made a noise.
Phone that's hooked to the wall, you know, and it has a cord.
And you knew that it was operational. You could use it. And if you didn't hear that and it was dead, it meant you couldn't use the phone. It's like the battery on your phone is 0 or there's no signal, okay? So he start his prayers and he could tell whether or not there was a signal, whether or not he was in direct communication with God. So the wall went up and he was like, why is there a wall? What have I done? So he starts to examine his day and he realizes, well, I upset the drunk boat operator who had left early. He got upset with me. And that is actually what's preventing me from praying and being in communion with God and having communication with God. So what does Saint Ephrem do? He immediately leaves his cell and he walks 9 hours in the dark, in the night, to find that boat operator, knocks on his door and says, Costa, please forgive me that I upset you so that I can liturgize. So that's really hard. Like, that's wild because he wasn't in the wrong. It wasn't that Saint Ephrem hadn't got there in time. No, the boat operator had left earlier than he ought to have. So from like just a non-spiritual perspective, Saint Ephrem wasn't in the wrong. There should have been no reason why God wasn't communicating with him. And yet he didn't. Another circumstance, Saint Ephrem is in his cell. A young man comes to talk to him. He goes on and on. He's talking about all these different things. I think he was a student. He's just yammering on. And finally, Saint Ephrem says, I have been trying my hardest ever since you walked in here, not to pass out from the stench that is coming from you because you believe in the Darwinian theory of evolution. So Saint Ephrem literally says to the guy to his face, you reek, and I'm trying literally to physically not be sick. And yet he didn't lose grace for that. Mm-hmm. So how would we know that? We wouldn't know that because it's not the criteria we would judge things by. He knew it because he was in constant communication with God. So that's how we say leptothema in Greek. That's how delicate, that's how precise, his spiritual life was, that he was able to perceive that. It's amazing. That's
It
what we're
is.
talking about, that spiritual sensitivity.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the story before that, because I think you said something so important for people to think about, is that with the boat operator, Saint Ephraim was not wrong. And we can think about this in
Yeah,
terms of our relationships, maybe with our spouse. Like, you think about an argument you've had, you can be right, but it doesn't mean that there's like communion
yeah,
is intact, right? You can have broken communion. You're like, well, I'm right. Well, that's different than being in communion with each other, right?
yeah, exactly.
Totally
And
different.
it's also interesting just to note that being right doesn't necessarily attract the grace of God.
Hmm.
So there's something else that we might be missing, and it's good for us to remember that story, to think, maybe I'm not seeing the situation precisely. Maybe I'm not, I don't know the totality of the situation. Maybe I'm seeing it wrong. So although I feel like I'm right, maybe I'm not right, because in that case, Saint Ephraim could have been like, God, why would you possibly not communicate with me? Because the man got upset with me. But obviously, the fact that the man had gotten upset was what somehow affected Saint Ephraim's relationship with Christ, and he couldn't find prayer. And so until he could rectify that and then again acquire that peace, was the only way that he could proceed with his prayers.
Hmm.
So like, that's outrageous maybe for where we are, but there's like things that if we look at our own life, we can probably perceive different types of sensitivity. Like, a story that struck me when I was thinking about this topic is a really good friends of ours, who actually we first learned about Orthodoxy through them. So I remember he told me a story years ago, and I meant to tell him before I told the story. So I'm curious if he even remembers this story. But so prior, before they were Orthodox, they would smoke cigars. They had this practice of smoking cigars. So, and maybe even when they were Orthodox for a time. So he ended up becoming the godfather of another young man. And they're with this young man one day, soon after the baptism. And the young man says, why don't we smoke a cigar together? And his godfather and godmother say, actually, we kind of have thought about that. And we feel that where we actually take Holy Communion with our mouth, that maybe it's not appropriate for us to smoke cigars and inhale this, I think St. Pisces calls it the incense of demons. Smoke is the incense of demons.
He does, yeah.
So they said, we feel like it's not appropriate for us to do that anymore, since we received the body and blood of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And the young man who had just been baptized, anyone who's been baptized as an adult or within where you've had conscious memories, you probably remember how heightened your senses are when you're baptized, like your spiritual senses.
Mm-hmm.
And the young man broke down weeping. He broke down weeping because he was enlightened he was enlightened to know that this is what our faith is. It permeates every part of our life, that there's nothing that we can or cannot do that isn't going to make an impact on our relationship with Christ. Like, that's the sensitivity he felt reflecting on that. And that's what we should feel when we reflect on things like what I do, what I say, what I think. Does that attract Christ, or does it push him away from me?
Because there's no neutral setting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even to maintain Christ means we have to at all times be watchful, be following our conscience, be careful at all times, be modest, like all these things, be humble. So it's such a left theme. It's such a delicate theme, and so beautiful, because our faith is so replete with opportunities for us to attract Christ's grace. Like, that's what it also means. It means that in the tiniest ways, we can attract Christ's grace. He'll come and be with us and dwell in us, just from tiny acts of reverence. And then gradually, they become so large that we become like a Saint Ephraim that feels that wall go up. I can share another story that
Yeah.
like really, gets at the heart of this as well. So my professor, who we've spoken of at other times,
Mhm.
he told this story once when we were in class so his father was a priest, and his mother, he said, was very strict, typical, really Greek mother, very strict mother. So one day he was out playing with his friends, and he was supposed to be home at a certain hour, and he wasn't. They got carried away playing, and he didn't realize what time it was. So his mother said to his father, go out and find him. And I mean, I want you, there's a Greek term that says like nefas xilo, you're going to eat wood. I want you to give him wood. Like you're going to give him a beating is basically what it is. So the priest, the father, sets out to find his child, and he sees his child, and he says, okay, it's time to come home now. Calm. No, there's no like upset, nothing. Just come on, we got to go home now. So they start walking along to go home. And as they're coming down the street, well, they're still coming down the street, the mother opens the door to look out to see that they're coming. And in order for her wrath to be placated, the father took my professor by the ear, very gently, took him by the ear, just gently. And Silangidis was so moved at the gentleness with which his father touched his ear, so that the mother thought that the father was pulling him by his ear, but he did it with such gentleness that Silangidis, his heart was so pierced with that love of his father that he began to weep. He began to weep at the sensitivity with which his father held his ear. So he said, of course, my mother's now watching this scene. My father's walking down the street holding my ear. I'm weeping. And she was so glad. She was so what she saw before her. That's beautiful. Just the gentleness. So that his father would make it seem as though he was punishing him. He just held onto his ear so gently. And the gentleness with which the father held onto his ear provoked the child to weep. That's beautiful. That's really, which you see more in children, you see more in the newly baptized, because we haven't allowed those calluses haven't built up on our heart, right? So you see that spiritual sensitivity in children, and you see it in the newly baptized. We need to cultivate that. We need to keep those calluses away from our heart, and we need to work hard to remove them when they have come.
Yeah, maybe you can explain to people in case they don't know about what is different about the newly baptized. Like, why are they more spiritually sensitive in that moment? It may be obvious, but let's just make sure.
Yeah. So in the Orthodox Church, we don't believe baptism as just like a confession of faith. Like, I want everybody to know that I believe in Jesus Christ, that I believe he died for my sins. And so I'm going to express my faith by getting baptized. This is not what we believe. We believe, and when I say we believe, I mean, it is a fact that when a person is baptized in the Orthodox Church, because of the apostles, because of the way Christ instituted things, where we saw with St. John the Baptist, Christ did it himself to show us the way. He gave that authority to the apostles, that the apostles passed down the authority to remit and retain sins, whose sins you remit are remitted, whose sins you retain, I don't know if that's exactly the word, they are retained. In other words, whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven. And those whose sins you do not forgive, they are not forgiven. Christ gave this power to the priests, to the bishops, okay? So when the priest, through the power that Christ has bestowed on him through the Holy Spirit, through the ordination, when he does this whole service where he sanctifies the water, he does exorcism prayers to the person, and the person is ontologically changed. Ontologically. So it's basically like we had a heart defect with our ancestral sin. This heart defect is going to make it impossible for us to receive grace, and it's going to make it so that when we die, we remain dead. In other words, we don't have access to the kingdom of heaven because of this ancestral sin that we've inherited. So when we get into the baptismal water, it's funny, on Sunday during Sunday school, one of my little Ukrainian boys in the parish was explaining this. I said, we were talking about Noah, and so the image of the waters of baptism, and what is that like? I said, what is that like when there's a baby? And he said, it was very sweet that he said it in English with his adorable accent. And he said, when the Orthodox priest blesses the water, when the Orthodox priest puts the baby in the water. And I was like, there's his spiritual nobility coming out that he, perceives that even as a child, as a young person.
Mhm.
So it becomes ontologically changed. Our heart defect is actually, that's like basically the operation. And then because that has changed, now we are able to receive the grace of God that we were not able to receive in the same way prior. God can move in our life. He can do all sorts of things. But St. Hesychius, I think that's how you say his name, one of the Desert Fathers, explained it this way. Before baptism, grace is on the outside,
Mhm.
and the devil's basically on the inside. After baptism, grace is on the inside, and the devil's on the outside. So this is why when we get newly baptized, we are literally ontologically changed. We are not who we were before baptism. We might
Mhm.
still have the same inclinations because of our habits, right? We've cultivated maybe sinful lifestyle because, I mean, if we're adults, if we're babies,
Mhm.
obviously, no, we're just perfectly pure.
Mhm.
And the child was pure in a sense before baptism, but now baptism provides the passport basically to the kingdom of heaven because it takes away that ancestral sin. So when we're baptized as adults or as older children, we perceive this more intensely because we're aware, right? We're conscious. We're not infants. The baby receives just as much grace, and there's lots of amazing miraculous stories. The abbess that I knew, who when she was baptized as a baby, as like a 2-month-old, held her own candle, and the priest said, "This is a sign that she will give much light to the world." So,
Wow.
yeah, like babies also
Mm.
experience this grace, right? But anyway, as adults, we actually perceive this. So, and it testifies to it even more. It's like, I remember when my brother was baptized, he said to me, I don't know how to describe the grace. He said, it's like trying to explain to someone who has never seen in color, who has only ever seen in black and white, what it means to see in color. How do you describe that to someone? You can't.
Yeah.
They have to experience it. So that's why the newly baptized, when we're newly baptized, we feel these spiritual intense, we think we feel the grace of God very present. And you can, if you work very hard and you cultivate that, then you won't lose that grace. You'll be able to maintain that, but it's very difficult to do that. I remember there's a life of a saint, and I can't remember the saint's name, but they talk about that. They specifically say in his life that he never lost the grace of his baptism. Not that the Holy Spirit leaves and never comes back. We can't, once we're baptized, we're baptized. But what we can do though is prevent that sanctifying grace from continuing when we put up those barriers.
Yeah. Which is why we have confession.
Yeah. And if I haven't explained baptism properly, it's because, yes, I have a master's degree in theology. Yes, I'm married to a priest, but it does require a theologian to properly express those things. So I might not have conveyed it properly. There might be a priest that would do, Father John for sure would be able to tell us precisely. So I'll get Father John to listen afterwards and he'll tell me.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, I wanted to go back to the story you had told before that, because I think it kind of related to the whole idea we talked about last time, which was covering the sins of others. And I think the spiritual sensitivity is part of that.
Yeah,
Um, I was in a complicated situation, let's say a few years ago, where there was many people involved, each with their own, um, desires and inclinations, each with their own kind of baggage and where they were in this situation. And it was really difficult to move together, um, to make decisions or to, um, to come to some agreement about things, right? And I could only see from my point of view, right, of like, well, here's the direction we should go. And I watched as Yarnisa, here was able to kind of gingerly step carefully, a little to the left or a little to the right, to taking everybody into consideration, knowing where everybody is. And I think we often only see from our own point of view, but people who are spiritually sensitive, um, they can do that. And by the left and right, I don't mean that like off the narrow path. I mean, bending this way for somebody, bending another way for somebody else, for their sake, right? Or for covering their other people's sins. And it's, I couldn't see that until after the situation, not during it, you know. But once I saw it, I thought, wow, that was really a beautiful act that kept a lot of arguments and, cutting off of people from happening, right? It could have gone really bad otherwise.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's discernment, and then you see how the whole community benefits from someone who has that intense awareness of the grace of God, so that they can navigate that with the help of God, not by their own rational mind,
Mhm.
but actually by the guidance of the Holy Spirit,
Yeah.
because of that sensitivity that they have cultivated through prayer, through their spiritual life.
And it seems like isn't that what we kinda want? I mean, we're not just kind of creating Christian communities and following a set of rules, like, it really should be somebody who's spiritually enlightened, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Guiding us.
yeah. That's why we want an experienced spiritual father.
Yeah.
That when we talked about that before too, something I didn't say when I said, seek a spiritual father, pray, the one you have, you have. But St. John Climacus, uh, in particular, but St. Simeon the theologian, like lots of people, St. Gregory Palamas, talk about the spiritual father. They talk about being very scrupulous about who you choose as a spiritual father beforehand.
Mm.
You measure it, you look at, because St. John Climacus says you don't want to mistake a patient for a doctor or a sailor for the captain.
Mhm.
So we are very discerning when we try to choose these spiritual people to guide us. And then the fathers say, once you've chosen, that's it. No more
Right.
scrutinizing. St. Joseph the Hesketh talks about that. If I say it's black and it's white, you say it's black because I said it's black, kind of mentality.
Mhm.
Which again is radical. And we've talked about all sorts of things with Christianity that's radical. It's not of the world. People in the world are not going to understand that. That's fine. They don't need to. It's not for the world.
Mhm.
That's, Christ says, I pray not for the ones you haven't given me. I pray for those you've given me. If the world wishes to understand, it can understand and it can join us because we want them to join us. But we don't need to justify, to explain
Yeah.
anything. This is our spiritual law. This is our kingdom. These are the rules of our, not religion. These are the rules of our kingdom.
Mhm. Yeah, and if you've kind of been careful to in the front end of that process, then I think that gives you some, I don't wanna say security, but, when it's gonna be hard to obey your spiritual father at some point, but if in the beginning you've been careful to pick someone you trust, right, that you don't jump into a relationship where
Yeah.
without thought and care and prayer,
Yes,
and when
exactly.
then when it's hard to be obedient, you're like, "Okay, well, we have a history. This was clearly
Yes.
God's will that this
Yeah.
relationship was established."
And
Um,
it's the same thing as what we're talking about, right? If you're faithful, and if he that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in that which is much. And that
mm,
he that isn't unjust, like the scriptures say, he that is unjust in the little things is also unjust in the great things. So when we show obedience in the little things, then it's easier for us to show obedience in the bigger things.
yeah, the spiritual life is all about growth, and I think maybe sometimes as people who come to the church, come to faith older, um, we could maybe wanna do big acts of piety, but we're not really doing the little things, like, we have
Yeah,
no foundation. It can be a stumbling block,
yeah.
right? Let's see, well, did you have any other stories for us you wanted to share or quotes?
Yeah, well, the something else that I was thinking of is, if anyone remembers other Siddharas, we've talked about him, I think, on these talks, and I talk about
Mhm.
him a few times in my book. He was a monk from Philothea Monastery, and he worked miracles in the name of his spiritual father and in the name of his spiritual grandfather. And once when we were with him at the monastery and we were chatting about different things together, I said to him, so a lot of times we would call him Papuli, which is like an endearing term, like grandfather. And so I was like, Papuli, why don't you tell us some things about the Panigia, about the Mother of God? And he paused and he said, you have to be alone for me to talk to you about her, which I thought was interesting. So
Mhm.
anyway, I mentioned it to one of the nuns, and the nuns said to me, it's because he becomes very emotional when he talks about the Mother of God because
Mm.
of his spiritual sensitivity and his love and reverence for her, that he wouldn't want to talk about it in front of a bunch of people because he knows that he would become emotional. And she told me a story that one evening when he was sitting down with them, with like a group of people, he bowed his head and he began, tears started to roll down his cheeks, and he was wiping them away saying, excuse me, but at this time of night, the love of the Mother of God pulls me. Like, that's how sensitive he was, that even in a particular time in the evening, obviously probably it was when he would do certain prayers to her, would be my guess, or maybe if he had had an experience at that time of night, so it would remind him of it, and he would begin to shed tears. And so then I said, that's why, Constantina, he didn't want to talk to you in front of people, because he would weep. That's such beautiful spiritual sensitivity. And we've talked a lot about attracting the grace of Christ and the grace of God in our series. We haven't spent as much time talking about the intercessions of the Most Holy Theotokos. She's the prime example of everything we've been talking about. We've used all sorts of different lives of the saints, but really every example I should have used at least one with the Mother of God in it, because she exemplifies all of these virtues, all of these things. This was who she was, it's who she had become. And for us to call out to her when we don't feel like we're spiritually sensitive, when we do feel like there's calluses on our heart, for us to cultivate a relationship with her so that we would be so sensitive as to weep. Many saints would weep just to say her name. Saint Joseph the Hesychist would weep. He would kiss her icon many, many times out of this love, and think like the way you think of a mother, like the way you love your mother, especially a young child that just doesn't get away from their mother. It's as soon as my mother would walk in the door, we were clinging to her, like she walked into one room, we followed her into it. Like she literally couldn't get us away from her. That's how much we love to have her come into the home. That's what it's like for these saints with the Mother of God, because of the degree of their spiritual sensitivity.
Yeah, you talked about Panagia at the end of the last episode. I don't know if you remember that, but that maybe you could re-explain that. I thought was really beautiful.
Yeah. So when we were chatting at the end of the last episode, you asked about spiritual sensitivity, and I hadn't thought of this, but you had mentioned that amazing thing about spiritual people being so precise in measuring every word and being so careful, that it made me think of her. And so, the Mother of God, she was sinless. We don't believe in the Immaculate Conception, because she inherited ancestral sin like everyone else did. But she chose not to sin. So it was like we talked about being baptized and you maintain that grace. That's what her state of being was. She worked hard to maintain a state of purity. She didn't sin in her words, she didn't sin in her actions, and she didn't even sin in her thoughts, which, as we talked about, Saint Silouan the Athonite, who's right, let's see if I can touch him at there, Silouan the Athonite. One time he was praying, and he kind of had the question, I wonder though if she sinned in her thought. Maybe she didn't sin with her body, maybe she didn't sin in her words, but maybe in her thoughts she sinned, since of course we know that's where we sin the most frequently. And it's we're most unaware of is when we sin in our thoughts, or where maybe it's easier for it to be hidden from us because we just have it and we don't think about it. So he was praying about this, and he heard the voice of God enlightened him, and the voice said to him, not even in her thoughts, that she didn't sin even in her thoughts. But she believed that she was so, because I remember as a child thinking, she must have known she was different. She must have looked around her and been like, no one's like me. I must be someone great. As a child also, I didn't know that she lived in the temple and her particular circumstances. I just assumed she would look at herself, she would look at other people, and she'd be like, I'm sinless. It's a fact, right? Because I had the mind of a child. Now, as a person who's read, patristic works, who's learned something, I see that I've learned that in her life, she believed herself so unworthy. She actually didn't think that she was even worthy of being the handmaid of the young woman who would bear the Messiah. That's how lowly she thought of herself. And it was because She was so acutely aware of what it was to be tempted. She understood what it felt like to have both the human inclination to sin and the temptation to sin. Because we can't blame everything on the devil. Our human nature, our corrupt human nature, also inclines towards sin because we are unhealthy. That's what happened when Adam and Eve sinned and we were cast out of paradise, as we inherited this spiritual illness, essentially. She was aware of that. And because of that awareness of temptation, she believed that she was weak and lowly and unworthy. She was naturally humble. That was her state of being. And so because of that, like, that's how spiritually sensitive she was, that she could perceive that. It's, that's who she was. She was incredible. And we should call out to her all the time, like every room in our house, with the exception of the bathroom, should have an icon of her. And the reason why, to bring it back to spiritual sensitivity, the reason why we don't have icons in the bathroom. And when the priest comes to our house and he blesses our house, he doesn't bless the bathroom. He blesses the closets. We open the doors to the closets. And it's because of the holy water. So we don't, throw it mistakenly down a drain or, in an unclean place. Okay. So when we talk about cultivating spiritual sensitivity, maybe we're not at that level of Saint Ephrem of Catanakia or Saint Silouan of Essex, the spiritual son of Saint Sophrony of Essex, the spiritual son of Saint Silouan, who once someone asked him questions about Theoria, about the experience, like Theoria in the Orthodox Church. There's beautiful descriptions of Theoria, but essentially direct communication with God. They asked him some questions about this, and he described the state of Theoria and what that experience is for a person in second, or what is it? Third hand, second hand, like if it's someone else, right?
Second hand, yeah.
He described it in second hand so that he could hide the fact that he himself had experienced these things. So externally, he didn't sin. He covered the fact that he had had these spiritual experiences, right? But internally, his heart had a little movement of pride when he described this to the other monk. And because of that tiny tinge of pride that he felt within himself, he felt that grace departed from him. That's how delicate the matter is. That's how leptot the femme is. So another story that kind of gives that idea, Saint Ephrem of Catanakia tells a story about, and this story was told to me the day I was baptized, to emphasize to me, don't judge people. It's the biggest sin you can fall into. It'll push away the grace that you've received in your baptism as fast as possible.
Yeah.
And so there's Saint Ephrem of Catanakia was on the Holy Mountain, and there was a monk who would go around his little kelli, his little tiny ski. And, in the Orthodox Church, they bang a talaton, which is like a wooden plank. They knock on it. And they also bang a simandron, which is like a metal piece. They don't bang it, but they kind of it makes a sound. They kind of, I don't know why, I'm not a musician, but they tinkle with it or whatever they do. So anyway, this monk would go around his little skeet to call people to prayer, and he would bang on tin cans. Another monk saw this monk do that from a certain distance away. And he was like, what's with this guy? Is he out of his mind? Like, why is he doing that? There's no one even around to call the prayer, just banging on tin cans. And because that monk had criticized the monk who banged on the tin cans, Saint Ephrem of Catanakia, who again had such spiritual sensitivity that he could perceive the grace in himself and in others, and he saw grace depart from that monk who judged him. So that's how delicate it is. That's how careful we have to be.
Yeah, so let's talk about that carefulness for a minute, because it can be a little, I think at least, intimidating being who we are, who I am, right? I'm nowhere near that spiritually sensitive, right? And so I know we've already said, this is, at least we said in the last episode, that we're not talking about sensitivity in a neurotic way, right? But it has to be something from the inside. But as you were talking through some of these stories, it really shows also that God is hiding a great amount of our sinfulness from us. He's only showing us what we can handle, and we can't handle that much, right? These saints did the work that allowed them to handle seeing themselves fully and completely, right? I'm nowhere near that. I know that God is still hiding a whole bunch of this stuff from me for my own sake, right? I think at least.
Yeah, I think that
And that's
that's
why I'm not as careful in those little things because I'm not aware that I'm even doing them, right?
but I think it's insightful to say that God a little bit hides it from us, because if in a moment we saw who we fully are in full light, it'd be like, so we would become so despondent, we wouldn't be able to pick ourselves back up. So it's a
Now, this
mercy.
it is, but let me just pause you because I know you'll know who this is. Was it St. Anthony that as he was ascending after he departed, where he had a dream where he saw the net of
He
around the
had a
world?
vision. Yeah, he had a vision of like basically a battlefield and all of the ways that people were ensnared by the evil one. And when he saw that, he looked and said, who could possibly be saved? And he heard the voice that says humility,
Yeah. So maybe
which
that's
will
for next
be
week.
next week.
But it's still that's what it reminds me of, right? Of like if
Yeah,
we could see ourselves, it's like, well,
yeah.
might as well give up now, right?
But we do want to see ourselves. So it is a mercy that Christ doesn't reveal it to us all at the one time, but we want him gradually, siga, siga, to reveal it to us. We want to know. We want to know what draws grace towards us and repels grace. We want to know this, but bit by bit, so that we can. It's like if suddenly you decide today to change your whole lifestyle, you can only do it little bit by little bit. You can't manage it otherwise. You won't even be able to make any kind of change. If it's such a huge thing, you can't. So you have to just do bit by bit. How do you pack a house? One box at a time. How do you become aware of our sins? One step at a time, with a lot of diligence, though, to pay attention to ourselves, to have that self-awareness. So it starts with the little things. Again, it's the same thing that, St. Pisces talks about. So like, if we think about just like the tips of like, okay, we talk about these huge, amazing stories of these saints having these great spiritual insights. How do we do it? We follow our conscience. We don't neglect the little things, so that we cultivate this reverence, this spiritual sensitivity in greater things. And, St. Sophrony and St. Porphyrius talk about this. They talk about the Christian being a poet. The Christian must be a poet. Both of them say that. And when St. Sophrony talks about it, he says, you move from the small to the infinite. And when St. Porphyrius talks about it, he says, when we say love, we don't mean the virtues that we will acquire, but the heart that is pervaded by love towards Christ and others. We need to turn everything in this direction. So we focus on the small things. How do I show Christ's love in this small thing? It might seem small. It isn't small, though, because it's going to lead to the greater things. How can I, figure out the way to please my friend and also be spiritually benefited? But first we put Christ. First you put Christ, then you gain that you are spiritually benefited, and how you can please your friend in the right way. You can help them, you can assist them, all of those things. And then, so when we talk about like reverence and the little things, there's so many things that I learned from the nuns about this. Like, do you know when the nuns would wash the dust off of the icons, they wouldn't discard it. Like they use cloth specific for the icons. These are the cloths that we use to wipe the dust off of the icon. And this is the iron that we use to iron liturgical, garments or coverings. We don't use it on our, on our shirt or on our vest. Like such carefulness.
These are the shoes for church and church alone. And
Exactly.
and if you drop a little kernel of coliva, we were
Yes.
told, certain types of coliva, certain amount of prostrations per little grain of coliva that hit the floor. So
exactly, because it cultivates spiritual sensitivity. So if I have to do a prostration for every kernel of coliva that falls on the ground,
50
then I'm going to
everyone.
well, that's a strict one. So if I'm going to do 50 prostrations for every kernel of coliva that falls on the ground, why? What's the purpose of that? That sounds ludicrous. I'll tell you what the purpose is: to cultivate spiritual sensitivity in greater things.
Mhm.
So if you're going to be so careful, you're going to dive to catch the grain of koliva before it hits the floor. You're going
Mhm.
to do the same thing when it comes to sin. When you're about to do something that you're going to sin, you're going to run. You're going to do whatever you need to do in order to avoid committing that sin, in order to
Mhm.
avoid offending that person, in order to avoid repelling the grace of Christ. So the reverence that we can exhibit, it never ends, like St. Paisius wouldn't even lay on a bed. He went somewhere once, and if the way he would lay on the bed, he'd have to point his feet toward the icons. He wouldn't even do that.
Mhm.
This is why we don't put icons or even books. We don't put them on, we try our best to avoid putting them on the chair where we sit, put them on
Mhm.
the arm, put them on a cushion. That's reverence in the small things, and that cultivates reverence in the larger things, so that even without knowing it, then we start to perceive things like smoking cigars that's
Mhm.
not good for me. That's not a reverent thing for me to do. Those things we become aware of on our own without someone else having to tell us, because we've started to cultivate this reverence. And so we feel that movement within our heart, because we've removed the calluses, or we're trying
Mhm.
to remove the calluses, and that softened heart. Like, really, when you think of spiritual sensitivity, it's about the softened heart. That's what
Right.
we're talking about, a soft heart.
Yeah, and I hope we're driving the point home to everybody that we're not talking about a list of detailed things that you have to do. We're talking
Yeah.
about, as I don't know, as God is enlightening you with these things, these are outpourings of an inner state. So we're not saying if you drop Kaleva or if you do, that's not what we're talking about, right?
I
That's
mean,
really
if you drop
important.
Buddha and you feel like your conscience tells you to do 50 prostrations, do 50 prostrations. We're
Sure.
never gonna we're never gonna do ourselves wrong by following our conscience.
Mhm.
We follow our conscience so completely that eventually the point is for the conscience to it not be a conscience. It's literally like the voice of God. That's how precise the saints had gotten, where it was like it was no longer their conscience. Their conscience was so in tune with God that it
Mhm.
was God Himself. They could perceive that. It wasn't just like
Yeah.
a twinge in the conscience or whatever. Follow your conscience. We're never going to hurt ourselves by doing more. But no, we don't want to be neurotic. And no, it certainly isn't. We should recognize when things are becoming a little bit of an obsessive compulsive
Yeah.
act. We should recognize that, and we should take that to confession, because sometimes the evil one has provoked us to take it in that direction. So it's
Mhm.
not even necessarily that we need to change our habits. It's that we need to be mindful of that we might be being tempted to fall into that. And that kind of nuance is for a spiritual father to discern, is for the priest to explain when we, bring that before him. But we can always do more. Like St. Porphyrius said, I remember I listened to a talk by one of his spiritual daughters, and she said, it was so funny. He was like, "Do you do prostrations?" And she was like, "No, I thought that was just for monks." He's like, "No, you can do them too." He's like, "When you drop a fork, when you're cooking and you drop the fork, bend down. When you bend down to get it, do a full prostration." Like, he meant like incorporate it into your life, And this is what we're talking about, incorporating reverence into our life.
Okay, so that was number 1 and 2. Do you have a number 3?
Right, too.
Number 1
Yes.
was follow your conscience. Number 2, with the reverence in the little
Don't
things.
neglect the little things.
Don't
Number
neglect them.
3, show reverence with little things. You
Okay.
know, so that means, being mindful of where we put icons, never throwing icons in the garbage. If you
Mhm.
have a paper icon from a bulletin, it needs to be burned.
Mhm.
Being mindful of where we put books, not spitting after we've taken Holy Communion.
Mhm.
St. Paisius says there was a man, when he talks about reverence, he says there was a man who, because he spit in an unclean place after receiving communion, he became demon possessed.
Wow.
Again, did the man know that? Probably not. But because
Mhm.
St. Paisius had that spiritual insight, he understood where it originated.
Mhm.
So we just have to we show God the disposition of our heart. We make mistakes. It's not that we don't make mistakes, we make mistakes. It's
Mhm.
about acknowledging those mistakes and trying not to do them.
Okay. So was there a number 4 or just 3?
That was it. Unless you must have a number 4.
No, no, this was a little harder topic because, we're kind of dancing around the issue a lot, I think, I'm not spiritually sensitive, so it's not
Yeah, exactly. That's how I
not
feel
like
too.
worry where I'm an
It's
expert.
not something I can't speak from my experience.
Yeah.
I can only speak from what I've read in the lives of the saints or what has, occurred to me when I've heard other people tell me stories.
Mhm.
Like, um, there's so many things where we can see that where if we like just
Yeah.
put those, put those eyeglasses on to see things around us that indicate spiritual sensitivity. Like the other day, we had a young guy show up at church, non-Orthodox, when we were going to have vigil for the Annunciation, and he was there. Actually, he had asked right away to like help, and so he's like, "Can I sweep?" And I was like, "Sure." So he started to sweep, and then Father John, because we were, you know, so those who don't know, anyway, this is what happens when you're married to a priest. You go really early, and so Father John came out of the altar and he began the service, what we call kero. Kero in Greek means like the time, and it's because so before the priest prays, he prays.
Mhm.
He does a service of prayer before he does the service. That's how spiritually sensitive the fathers of the church were, that they knew for the priest to even be in a state of readiness to pray the service, he needed to pray before he prayed. So
Mhm.
when Father John came out of the altar, I turned to the kid, the kid that sort of was in the narthex, and I said, now Father John will say the prayers before he prays. And he was like, you see, this is what I like about Orthodoxy. And like that's a spiritual sensitivity. So the word kero, it comes from the psalm. It is time for the Lord to act.
Mm.
That is what the deacon, if you had a deacon, that is what the deacon would come to the priest and he would say, it's time for the Lord to act. And then the priest begins these kero prayers, and they begin outside the iconostasis, and then they go inside and they begin the service of proskimidi or matins or whatever it is that they're starting. Like there's so many things that if we look around and start to think of like, how does our faith convey that spiritual sensitivity? We'll find it everywhere.
Yeah, I think spiritual readiness is a really good term that feels a little more down to earth, a little maybe closer to where we are. Instead of the higher heights of, spiritual sensitivity we're talking about, but just being
Yeah.
ready, preparing for communion, preparing the
Yes.
night before, these things like as you said, you can't just go in and and expect to kind of be present in the moment, right? Like it there's steps to it. Just like with Lent, we have those introductory Sundays to Lent, and Lent introduces us to Holy Week, and Holy Week to Pascha. It's
Yeah.
like there's layers of preparation
Yeah.
and bringing us along. So
Yeah.
um, that's a little, I think, easier to grasp, at least for me where I am, like being
Yeah.
spiritually ready,
Yeah.
lower level,
First step.
first step.
First step.
But I do love that we've come back to the conscience several times as well, because I think that's, as you've mentioned, that's God's. I think you've said this, but it's God speaking to us like that. That conscience is
Yeah.
part of how God reveals
Yeah,
Himself.
that's innate in us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to us in our situation. So it's not to everyone in the same way, in the same. So it's not like listening to people online like us.
No, exactly.
It's specific to you, like your spiritual father, and that's why that's so important.
Yeah.
Okay, so follow your conscience. Don't neglect the little things and show reverence in the little things.
Yeah. And then you'll show reverence in the greater things. We even see spiritual sensitivity in nature. There's a monk in the sayings of the no, I think it's a book where Father Hirovim is on the cover. I can't think of it. It's red and it's about the Athonite fathers. I can't think of what the title is. My brother has it. I borrowed it from him. But anyway, in that book, so it's like more contemporary. It's not like ancient fathers. It talks about a monk.
Contemporary ascetics.
Yeah, probably that is probably what it's called. Is
Contemporary
it?
Ascetics of Mount
It's
Athos,
red
volume
and it
1.
has
Yeah.
Father Hirovim kind of like with his knees up, like
Okay. Yeah, maybe.
yeah, sitting. Anyway, in it, they talk about this monk who would like go through. He was so aware of even how the creation glorifies God that when he'd see a little flower in the forest, he'd say, "Don't shout so loud." Like the flower is shouting the glory of God so loudly. Don't shout so loud. And when he was walking along the path and he saw two sticks laying on top of each other so that it looked like it was the sign of the cross, he moved one so that no one would even inadvertently trample on the sign of the cross.
Mm.
You know, there's things like that too, like
Yeah.
learning that we don't cross our legs in church because it's an irreverent form of the cross, a sign of the cross.
Mm-hmm.
I know
I
that that's
remember.
wild, but this is what our faith teaches us, that we are reverent even in those little physical gestures.
And that's why too, maybe the older ladies, who have come from generations and generations of being Orthodox, this is ingrained in them. So it's probably a little, surprising when they see maybe some younger Americans in church crossing their legs. Like, it's actually a cultural
Yeah.
difference, but based on the faith. Like,
Yeah,
we just don't
exactly.
have anything like that in American
Yeah. So
culture.
we're not aware. And so when someone corrects us,
Yeah.
we're not offended. We're like, oh, well, thank God you told me. Now I know.
Yeah.
The first time I was corrected, I was at a monastery. And the father said, we don't cross our legs because it's, the symbol of the cross. And so I was just like, okay, like,
Mhm.
thank you for telling me, because it's good to know. And then it's nice. Then it's like, wow, like that's amazing. Again, it's like that young, newly baptized kid weeping at the thought, like there's nothing that our faith doesn't permeate.
Mhm. Yeah. And Saint Paisios, I believe it was him when I think he was, like, changing the batteries on a radio that someone had given him, and he saw that the batteries had a little sign of the cross on it, and he was so happy that I think it was back when everything came from Taiwan or something. He's like, "Look, even the people in Asia love our Lord because it's got the little cross on the battery," you know? Just
Yeah.
such good thoughts everywhere, you
Yeah.
know? Alright, well, let's maybe wrap up this topic unless there's something else you wanna share.
I think that we pretty much covered everything. Just, it starts small and it grows. That's what our spiritual
Mm,
life is. We're not expected to immediately perceive grace departing, but we're expected to
yeah,
work toward that.
yeah. It's a lifelong goal. It's not gonna happen overnight, most likely.
Yeah. And through the prayers of the Mother of God, we can get there. We can
Yeah,
get there.
yeah. Okay, so what's our next and final topic for next time?
Our final topic is humility or humble mindedness.
Okay. So, looking forward to that one. Looking forward to that one a lot, actually. And you have some new things to share.
Oh, yes, I do. I forgot about that. So my third book was just published. It's published by Alexander Press, and it's called Upon This Rock. As you can see, so this is the harbor in St. John's on the island of Newfoundland, in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And you can actually see, so this is town. This is like downtown.
Mhm.
You can see where the houses are built literally on rock. So that shows you, I called it Upon This Rock because the island is literally nicknamed the Rock. So the title is Upon This Rock, Missionary Reflections of an Orthodox Priest's Wife. So it's a collection of letters that I write to a fictional parishioner that I've named Theophila because, like St. Luke, who dedicates the Acts of the Apostles and his gospel to Theophilus. Theophilus was a real person, but his name also means God lover. And the fathers, St. Bede, St. John Chrysostom, say, inasmuch as we are also God lovers, the gospel and the Acts of the Apostles were written for us. And so that's why I named her Theophila. So basically, it's like letters, it's like pastoral letters. It's things that I would wish for our parishioners to know. And for anyone who is in a parish from a perspective of a priest's wife, to give like a little insight into what it's like to serve Christ in this way, and what it's like to live in the world and to struggle in the world, and hopefully encourage some young, or not young, but women and men to consider serving as workers in the vineyard, because what does Christ say? The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. So
Yeah.
I did some drawings for it. You can see here the why. little sort of Celtic inspired. See what else we have in here. Some Viking graphics, Viking
I love
ships.
it.
Vikings, Orthodox Christian Vikings came to the
Mhm.
island of Newfoundland. There's a settlement in the northern peninsula in a place called St. Anthony. So it's published by Alexander Press, and as soon as I have a link to where you can purchase it, we will share that. But until then, you can just look at it. And there's the back. And on the back, I was really so on the back. This is what he chose to put, which I didn't expect, and I really like it. This comes from the first letter in the book. On the sacred day of your baptism, all your hope, zeal, and longing were fulfilled in the waters of baptism and the seal of the Holy Spirit in the chrismation that followed. Like the bud of a flower that in a single warm spring day opens its petals and blooms, you blossomed forth as an Orthodox Christian, a gift greater than our worth, but worthy of his compassion. In his instructions to catechumens, St. John Chrysostom says, when you receive the royal robe, when you are girt with the purple dipped in the Master's blood, when you will be crowned with a diadem which has luster leaping forth from it on all sides, more brilliant than the rays of the sun. Such are the gifts of the bridegroom, greater indeed than your worth, but worthy of his loving kindness. And then I continue. I congratulated you after the service and shared with you the same words a venerable nun shared with me after my baptism. Don't lose that grace. And with a bright and shining face, you told me in earnest, I'll try not to. But now on the anniversary of your baptism, I tell you, not simply to not lose it, but to multiply the grace you have received. And again, I quote St. John Chrysostom. Extend the holiness which thou hast received. Make the righteousness which comes from the laver brighter, and the gift of grace more radiant, even as therefore Paul did, increasing all the good things which he received by his subsequent labors and his zeal and his diligence. So essentially, St. Theophila is like a composite character of parishioners that we've had throughout our now almost 12 years since we first came here. And so there's lots of stories in there. People used to always say like, oh, when are you going to write about a book about Newfoundland? And I was always like, never, because it's super sparsely populated and I couldn't hide people's identities.
Oh,
This was a way where I could write to Theophila. So it might have been a real experience that I have with someone, and it mostly is. Only that person would know.
okay. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Theophila. I'm not saying any person came and we know, like a few times, but where it's like more generic, so it doesn't matter. But if it's something very personal, it's to Theophila. So it's to a fictional person, but it's based on all these, experiences and conversations that we've had throughout our years living on the island and attempting to spread the gospel of Christ. So
Yeah. Well, I don't want to embarrass you, but just that little bit like moved me, just thinking about, that we're called not to just kind of keep our own head above water a little bit and like treading, but we're actually called to like bring forth fruit to multiply.
yeah.
That's like a really it kind of wakes me up a little bit. Like sometimes I feel like I'm just, you know, barely keeping myself together here, and yet we're called to do a lot more.
And sometimes the barely keeping ourselves alive is what actually is multiplying grace. We just don't see it because Christ doesn't want us to see that, because then we'd be puffed up with pride and we'd lose the grace. So sometimes it really is just the literal act of keeping our head above water is actually multiplying the grace.
Well, that's good news for me.
So I'm really happy about this because, this book is especially like, for me. For other people, they're going to be like, cool. Most people love the first book. This is what most people love. And I'm very happy because the sisters are amazing. And so the sisters' love and their holiness comes through. And that's why it affects people. So this book is just mine. It's no one, you're not going to get that. What you got to know. But for me, it's like very obviously sentimental to get to, the words that basically literally were lifted out of my personal journals to now see them in typeset is so neat for me,
Yeah, but I mean, I think there's such a maybe an underutilized place for this kind of writing where we can just share our own stories and people can connect. It's
Yeah,
um
I mean, obviously, we want to be careful. We don't want to reveal too much,
yeah.
but there's definite opportunity for us to share the way that Christ has worked in our lives, the things we've struggled with,
Mhm.
all of those things. And then we remember, oh, okay, other people struggle with the same things I struggle with.
Yeah.
And, this is how they were able to overcome that difficulty. And it kind of gives you that enthusiasm and that encouragement.
Yeah. I think women especially need this. I don't know that men get as much out of it or not. I'd be curious to hear from the guys on that, but um I know I really feel encouraged by other people's stories of overcoming things or
Right.
being patient or whatever. So,
Mhm.
all right. Well, thanks again, Matushka. We have our last episode probably come out in about a week. And yeah, God bless you all. Thanks for being here.
Through the prayers of our Holy Father, as the Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen.
Amen.